Resident Evil, a series known for its slow-building terror, oppressive atmosphere, and survival horror gameplay. Now, what would be a perfect fit for an in-universe spin-off, you ask? Well, a first-person shooter, of course. At least this seemed to be the thought process at Capcom around 1999. Resident Evil Survivor was the first massive departure from series doctrine that RE fans would see, and, well, it's not what you would call a success story. But a little thing like a lack of success didn't stop the Survivor series from continuing for 4 entries. So, can a bad idea at least occupy the so bad it's good category? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Hey guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews. Welcome to the Resident Evil Retrospective. Like I said before, the Survivor sub-series didn't just end with the first entry. There's actually 4 games carrying the Survivor name, but today we're going to be focusing on the jumping off point. Trust me, we'll be getting to the other 2 in due time, and before you ask why not all 4, well, listen, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But first we need to start from the very beginning. A poorly documented beginning. After looking in every dark corner of the internet, I have found almost no information on the team that made this game and the real reason why it exists, so let's just assume Capcom wanted to capitalize on the success of the RE series, which was 3 entries deep at this point. For some incomprehensible reason, it was decided that this new spin-off would need to be a first-person shooter, perhaps having to do with the fact that the very first Resident Evil was supposed to be an FPS itself. Capcom, not being too experienced in this style, essentially dumped a shit ton of Resident Evil 2 assets into some 3D environments and called it a day. As you can assume, this didn't exactly make for the world's most engaging game, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Though I can't remember anything, I know that this was no way for anyone to die.
Known as Biohazard Gun Survivor in Japan, Resident Evil Survivor stars a new face to the series who's investigating the Umbrella branch on Sheena Island. Under the orders of Leon Kennedy, our protagonist infiltrates this Umbrella facility, but in the process managed to get himself on the receiving end of a helicopter crash. Waking up with no memory, our spy struggles to remember who he actually is and why people are accusing him of being a murderer.
Vincent, you are a murderer.
With a small emphasis on escaping from what has become an island filled with bioorganic weapons, zombies, and Umbrella sweeper team / human panthers? Yeah, your guess is as good as mine at this point. Amnesia plots typically don't result in what I would call innovative storytelling, and even with a few twists, Survivor's story still manages to underwhelm. Like most RE games, there's some pretty good world building to be found in files and diaries scattered around, which is a good time to mention the elephant in the room. I'm sure most of you have already noticed, but I'm playing the Japanese version of this game here. Why is that? Well, I was game hunting in Tokyo a few months ago with Import Gaming for the win, and more importantly, I ain't paying no $35 for a US version of this game. The good news is Biohazard Gun Survivor is 100% playable in Japanese since the voice dialogue is all in English and the menus are a breeze to navigate if you've ever played an RE game before. Of course, that does require a Japanese console or some type of region-free mod chip, so buyer beware. And now that I've come back from that tangent, yeah, the story kinda sucks. It's about as boilerplate as you get, and most players are going to see the plot twist coming a mile away. There really isn't too much series lore dropped other than Leon being mentioned once, and like we found out in part 4 of this retrospective, Leon Kennedy's name alone does not make a Resident Evil game. So with a crap story, the only reason left to play this game is the gameplay, right? Alright, let's get into it.
Die, Vincent! Die!
Survivor was made from the ground up as a first-person shooter, which was a brand new milestone for the Resident Evil series. Like I said before, the original RE was supposed to be an FPS, so this game doesn't technically venture as far from the beaten path as we all first thought. Since console first-person shooters were still figuring out how they wanted their controls to work, Capcom decided to alleviate some of the concern by including support for Namco's GunCon. But thanks to the Columbine shooting taking place mere months before the US release date, we Americans never got the option to do a little light gun zombie hunting. The good news is, this being a Japanese copy means I do have light gun support. The bad news? I don't have a CRT in my house, so I can't testify to how much this adds or subtracts from the experience. But if early reviews from the time are to be trusted, light gun use didn't drastically change too much. Movement in the game relies solely on the D-pad, which makes sense. This was a long time before the dual analog stick control scheme revolution, so I can't exactly subtract points for that. And besides, it actually works pretty well. I think this is mostly due to the environments being designed around the controls. Most areas are wide and relatively free of clutter on the ground, making for some pretty effortless movement. The fact that the entire screen essentially acts as your hitbox means a more traditional RE backdrop would have the player getting caught up on every little box or burnt out car strewn around. A lack of strafing is kind of disappointing, but to be fair, most areas aren't wide enough to even allow for it, so I can forgive it. And now that I'm thinking about it, it seems like 3D assets weren't the only thing taken from classic Resident Evil, as the controls act exactly like they do in normal RE games. Left and right turns your character on their axis, and forward always moves you in the direction you're facing. As an added little bonus, hitting the action button isn't necessary since items and doors can be interacted with just by touching them. And on a side note, it's kinda cool seeing weapons and items spinning in the air like I'm playing some 90s FPS game, which I guess technically I am. Combat works almost exactly like you're used to. Holding R1 aims your weapon and locks you in place, only now you have an aiming reticle to control. That's about it. Unlike classic RE games, readying your weapon doesn't come with any frames of animation, so shooting the enemy and then backing up or running past them is way more of an option, and once you get used to the wide berth you have to give enemies when passing by them, you'll be shooting and dodging with the best of them. Like most of these first-person gun-con shooters, pistol ammo is unlimited. The only thing you'll have to worry about is making sure you don't end up having to reload, as the very last zombie in the room is about 3 inches from your jugular. Reloading in the menu can be slow as all hell, so you'll learn early on to just fire your remaining shots after each encounter to trigger a reload. Series favorites like the grenade launcher, shotgun, and magnum can be found, and there's a few handguns scattered around as well. Ammo conservation is just about as important as it always is, even with infinite handgun ammo, which means we have to dance that old familiar dance of not using any magnum or grenade launcher rounds to the very last boss, and then beating him with like 30 of each. The old survival horror trope of running away instead of wasting ammo or herbs is still an option, but narrow level design makes it more of a situational thing and less of a universal option. For some unknowable reason, the devs included a mechanic where shooting an enemy will center your screen on them. Now, this isn't that big of a deal in rooms filled with slow-moving zombies, but when you're fighting groups of lickers or fast-moving dogs, the centering action can interrupt your next shot and place your reticle pretty far from where you originally had it. In the worst-case scenario, a stray shot hitting a BOW in the back of the room can shift your view enough to obscure the one you were actually trying to hit. This problem seems to happen most when fighting the Cerberus, so I'd suggest running from them whenever possible. Okay, so we have some pretty crappy combat. Well, maybe not crappy, but definitely unintuitive. Anyways, the point is, it's not that bad. During my 2-hour playthrough, I ended up finding my groove and adapting pretty quickly to the game's quirks. By the time I fought the end boss, I was running circles around him and getting off some pretty skilled shots, despite the controls working against me. If I had to give the controls in combat a grade, it would probably be a D+. Pretty bad, but far from unplayable. As for the other genre tropes, Survivor is lacking in some departments, but makes up for it in others. Instead of exploring a large environment and backtracking through it several times to solve puzzles, Survivor keeps you on a pretty linear route. There's still keys to find and doors to unlock, but you'll notice early on they always follow a predictable routine. When you enter an area, there's typically 2 doors. One is always locked, and the other one always contains the key to the locked one. As for puzzles, they are 100% absent, but to be fair, I don't think they would have added anything here. One cool little feature is the multiple paths you can take to the endgame. Throughout the campaign, there are several points where you can choose between a couple of different routes that can alter the enemies you'll encounter, files you'll read, and weapons you'll find. These choices add a bit of replay value to a game that takes less than 2 hours to complete, and the best part about them is the fact that they are handled so naturally. The game doesn't flash an on-screen choice in your face, giving you the option to take one way or the other. Hell, most of the time you won't even know you've made one of these decisions till you try to backtrack and find the way closed behind you. I thought this was pretty cool and helped keep Survivor from feeling cheap or unsubstantial. All this added together makes for some fairly passable gameplay. Not great, but back in the days of renting video games for a fun weekend, Survivor worked perfectly. Graphically, RE Survivor is an oddity. Capcom essentially dumped almost every 3D model from Resident Evil 2 into the game, and despite reviewers criticizing how bad these models looked up close, I can remember loving the fact that I could get such a good look at these zombies. The parts of RE2 that I loved were the areas that gave me a better vantage point to see these bloody corpses up close, and maybe it's just me, but early PS1 3D textures have always been kind of charming visually. The environments in the game range from pretty simple to relatively atmospheric. This area in the front yard of a house makes for a really cool condensed piece of zombie horror, and this nightclub is a nice little... Wait a minute, Heaven's Night? This has got to be on purpose, right? One problem with Survivor's reuse of RE2 assets is how little respect they paid to the source material. As an example, let me show you how they introduced the T-103. And here we have it, one of the most ferocious bosses in Resident Evil history, just casually walking into view. It feels like they just threw a bunch of random enemies in the game, which is a real missed opportunity seeing as how they nailed a T-103 entrance exactly once towards the end of the game. Now see, there's the bastard we all know and love. One thing they definitely didn't nail though is performance. The game runs relatively well in most areas, but get 3 or more enemies on screen and you'll be looking at a 10 frame per second slideshow. This slowdown is exacerbated by areas with complex textures, and when the game's running this slow, combat is not an option, so get ready to run in slow motion. But it's clear they tried to alleviate this issue with a few concessions. The dithered or checkerboard textures from RE1 are back, and I'm sure this low color depth mixed with a very short draw distance probably helped to slow down a lot, but we're still left with parts of the game that run at a snail's pace, which is exactly the speed the in-game menu moves at for some reason. Scrolling through your inventory after you've found a few herbs or ammo types can be agonizingly slow, and having to do this a few times in a row to equip the shotgun and then re-equip the pistol will have you cursing Capcom for not including some kind of weapon select button. And while we're on that note, why couldn't we just have the traditional RE style menu? It works so much better than whatever this is. I also noticed a good amount of screen blurring applied when the game's in motion. This hazy blur wasn't too bad at first, but if you're the type of person who gets motion sick from first-person games, I assume this effect will make things even worse. One other thing I want to point out isn't this game's fault at all. The PS1 is well known for its affine texture warping caused by Sony's use of approximate calculations regarding perspective, and in a first-person game like this, the system's one flaw is on full display. Like I said, this isn't Survivor's fault, but it's interesting seeing such obvious examples of the quirks inherent to PlayStation's unique architecture. My last complaint comes in the form of the game's cutscenes. For some reason, a good number of these cinematic sequences use incredibly compressed videos of actual in-game graphics, which looks exactly as terrible as it sounds. Not only do we get the low poly models we're already used to seeing, but we're also blessed with compression artifacts. Of course, the use of an upscaler like the FrameMeister will make flaws like this much more noticeable. The entire time I watched these, I was left wondering why the hell they couldn't have just been included as the in-game assets they already recorded. Some cutscenes switch back and forth between pre-recorded and in-game graphics, so it was definitely doable. So yeah, Survivor is pretty bad looking, but in a kind of interesting way. If you're a fan of the PlayStation platform, you really can't pass up a chance to see a representation of all of its quirks, but for the rest of you, yeah, I'd say steer clear. And there we have it. Resident Evil Survivor is not what I would call a must-play in the RE series. The connection to the rest of the series is almost non-existent, the gameplay is damn near terrible when viewed in a modern light, and the graphics, depending on your taste, are pretty bad. So yeah, this one isn't going to get a recommendation from me, unless you're the type of fan who likes to see inside slices of the games you love. Being able to get up-close views of classic RE2 3D models and seeing survival horror tank controls ported almost perfectly into a completely different perspective might be worth a quick look. And with less than a 2-hour runtime, quick is the keyword here. And if anything, the appeal of a pretty well-made RE-style soundtrack should convince some of you. Speaking of convincing, I have to get back to covering the next entry in the series, so goodbye for now. Here's hoping I see you next time right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for stopping by. If you like this video, check on screen for more entries in the series, and feel free to subscribe if you like my work. If you find yourself falling in love with this stuff, maybe check out my Patreon and join the group that has made all these videos possible. Thanks guys, and see you later.